Okay, so looking at the next lecture in relation to mortgages and moving on to repossession. So this is a lecture that will look at the bank's ability to seek repossession of the mortgaged property. And also within that, we're going to look at how the borrower can respond to that action. So we're looking at repossession really from both perspectives. We're not just looking at the mortgagee's ability to take the land, we're looking at how the mortgagor could debate or contest that and hold the bank back. So we'll be looking at both aspects of that in repossession. Then next week we'll be moving on to sale and also looking at the mortgagee's relationship with the mortgagor in terms of the borrower or the mortgagor's rights in the land itself, so their ability to get the land free of the mortgagee at the end of the term, and also kind of other things that can't be built into the mortgage, as well as considering the defence of undue influence as it applies to mortgages. So what I'd like to do in this session would be to first of all outline what that right to repossess looks like. So the inherent right of the bank or the lender to possess the land. Consider where it might be appropriate or best practice to achieve a court order in order to guarantee that repossession in the smoothest way possible, ensuring clean hands really for the bank. We can also then consider how the borrower, the mortgagor, could hold back the bank in some way from behaving in this way by asking for a postponement. And there are two key ways within which they can do that. One being postponement under Section 36 of the Administration of Justice Act 1970, and the other just being within the court's inherent powers to allow for the postponement of an action like this. So we're going to look at all of that together in order to determine how a dispute in relation to repossession starts out. So this is prior to the sale of the land, the impact of a lender wanting repossession of the property. So it's seen as an inherent right, and whenever we looked at how a mortgage was formed in the previous lecture, we saw that we historically would have viewed it as like a long-term lease. Now you know that if you've got a tenant, they're entitled to live there, entitled to possession of some sort. So that is still kind of evidenced in the bank's right to hold the land. They're treated as having a legal estate, so they have that right to possess pretty much immediately. It's not dependent on any form of wrongdoing by the borrower, unless there is something written into the mortgage agreement itself that would write that right away. Then it will usually be an inherent right. The lender obviously wouldn't want to exercise that right because they wouldn't be interested in being a tenant or in living in the property. So the only real reason they tended to seek possession is in the instance of wrongdoing, but it has to be allowed to happen. So the kind of authority for that is coming from the case of Four Maids Limited and Dudley, where the courts considered the repossession as an inherent right, using this phrase of dry ink. So they're stating there that the mortgagee may go into possession before the ink is dry on the mortgage. So basically, the minute the agreement is written, the bank could technically wander into the property and take possession, unless there is something in the contract, express or by implication, where they have contracted themselves out of that right. They have the right because they have a legal term of years in the property or the statutory equivalent. We looked at that in Section 85 of the LPA and Section 87 of the LPA, as Section 87 mirroring this notion of a lease that only stops whenever the last payment is made. So that inherent right to possess, that ability really for the lender to seek possession from the get-go is important. It's important to know that really it's not reliant on any wrongdoing of the borrower. And that could be for a range of reasons. It could be that the minute the mortgage papers are signed, they find out that the party they're dealing with has been fraudulent in some way, has deceived them in some way. The bank itself could collapse and need to take the property, or need to be able to satisfy the debt in some way by paying off its creditors. So there are a wide range of reasons why this isn't reliant on wrongdoing necessarily in terms of payment of the loan. There could be a wide range of reasons why the bank might have to be able to call in this debt quickly or to react in a swift way. And when we look at sale next week, it will make a little bit more sense because there's a procedure. There are timelines built in as to when the bank can react or respond when selling the land. Whereas this right to possess and take it and do something with it is a swifter way for them to find some form of redress. As I say, if there's wrongdoing, not necessarily because of payment, but some sort of identity fraud or some other thing that has put the bank on notice that all is not right, the bank are able to respond to that quite swiftly, that they're not allowed to do under Section 101 and 103 of the LPA, which relates to sale, that we'll be leading into next week. So as I say, generally they don't have any interest in being there. It's only necessary usually to take possession in certain key instances. However, whenever they do so, if they do take possession, they are then responsible for the property. So they have to ensure that the property is handled in a way that's appropriate, and they will be accountable for any potential increase or decrease in value or profit that occurs. Say, for example, when you're dealing with commercial property, repossessing that's a minefield because you're taking over a venture that it has got a commercial viability to it. So it's in your interest to make sure that that remains profitable, because you're then going to sell something that has a business use. So in White and City of London Brewery Company, we can see that the pub had been let as a tied house, which meant that it was tied as a brewery, instead of being a free house, which means that any company could use it. And the lenders were found at fault in that situation because they hadn't maximised the amount that the property could gain or earn. It had limited its use and limited its value. So it's best, whenever we looked at the powers of or the rights available to a mortgagee, it really would be best in instances like that where commercial property is involved, for them instead to appoint a receiver in thinking about business decisions or making commercial decisions like that. A receiver would be best placed to run a business or to make those commercial decisions. But generally what's happening, as I say, isn't that the bank, the minute the paper is dried, want to move in, because otherwise they would just become a tenant somewhere. They are obtaining this possession in order to be able to realise their finances, in order to be able to repay themselves effectively for the monies that have been passed across. So their key interest is to possess it so that they can sell it. Usually, obviously much easier to sell it without contesting mortgagors within the property. You don't want to be selling something to somebody with, people living there who are objecting to the proceedings. It's easier to possess it, repossess it, and then sell it. So the effects of repossession being quite obvious, that what the bank are seeking to do is to empty the property, and in doing so the previous owners, the people who lived there and had given the mortgage interest in the land, will effectively be made homeless. They will not have anywhere to live. So it's quite a drastic measure. It's seen as quite extreme, and there are usually a lot of ways that the bank will work with somebody to try to avoid it happening. There are pre-action protocols and things that are put in place to encourage better communication between mortgagee and mortgagor to prevent it getting that far, especially in current times where people have fallen into difficulties with repayments. It's seen as poor practice to head straight for repossession and to try and work through the situation with the mortgagors. As I say, we will look at some of the mechanisms that have been put in place to help mortgagors in those situations. But the impact of a repossession would be to make somebody homeless. So thinking about that impact and how devastating that would be really on people's lives, you're thinking, well, surely then what would need to happen is that a court must be involved in allowing that to happen. But historically not. And this has been reviewed a number of times since the Reykjavik case that you can see at the bottom. So that case was 1999, and as recently as 2018 we've had this stuff reviewed, and it's seen as best practice but not essential to have a court order to repossess. As we'll see in a moment, the court order to repossess is the thing that gives the borrower an action or an ability to respond, because their moment to object comes from a court order. So if you're not giving them a court order, you're making it very difficult for them to object. So the kind of notion behind dealing with this dry ink situation, the dry ink being the moment that they could technically walk back into the property and take it after signing the agreement to release the funds. In residential premises under Section 1(2) of the Protection from Eviction Act 1977, if any person unlawfully deprives that occupier of the premises, they're guilty of an offence unless they have reasonable cause that the occupier has ceased to reside in the premises. So what that effectively means is that the bank would appear to be given free rein where the property is empty. And that's what effectively happened in Reykjavik and Barclays Bank. We have notice given to an empty property, people who own multiple properties and reside in some. The property that related to this notice was actually going under some reconstruction work at the time. So the bank are sending notifications, some to one address and some to another address. The claimant in the case, so Reykjavik, say that they didn't receive the final demand, saying that the property would be entered for sale in an auction. So we have the claimant saying that they had no idea that this was going on, they didn't get the letter, and they've only heard about this from a neighbour. They say that they have, on the 30th of December, applied for an injunction to stop the bank from doing this, from behaving this way, that they want to contest that and deal with it. Unfortunately, however, the property itself had been sold on the 31st of December. So a day later, the property was sold, even though the application to stop the sale went in on the 30th. So So we're thinking, how can that have happened without a court order? We have the claimant going to court saying they think this is what's happening. They've heard it from a neighbour and they want to stop it happening. But the bank haven't had to give any notice because the property's empty and they can effectively enter and repossess. They've done that and then the sale has happened. It would make sense that that is unlawful in some way. However, the courts didn't feel that that was a fair representation. And when we look at Section 36 that they were considering at the time, Section 36 of the Administration of Justice Act 1970, they couldn't find that the legislature intended for a court order to happen in order to allow the borrower to hold off repossession. So it's a really odd thing. When we look at the Administration of Justice Act, we'll see that it's there as a way to hold off the bank repossessing. It has to come in response to a court order. If we're saying that for an empty property somebody doesn't need to give a court order, there's no opportunity then for the borrower to respond. There's nothing prompting their response. So it's very irregular, but unfortunately not illegal, and that's been upheld in a case that we'll look at in a sale next week when we look at Horsham Properties in Clark. So we have the ability to enter empty residential premises, repossess by the bank because they have the inherent right to repossess from the very beginning. And Ropi Gallic saying that it's not unlawful for them to do so. It can lead, however, to conflict where behaviours are escalated in that way. Obviously, any entry with people there or any violence committed during any entry would be criminal. But there are still arguments about trespass there. And it's evidence, there's a number of articles written. Martin Dixon talks about it. It's considered arbiter in some cases that it would be best practice to obtain a court order for residential premises. Again, not the law, but best practice. We move on then to commercial properties. So that previous slide was just in relation to residential, but there's another part of trespass that is related to within Section 6 of the Criminal Law Act 1977, which says that it would be criminal not just where there is somebody present, but where there is some sort of opposition to the person entering. So we've got a situation where somebody could enter in a forcible way or try to enter and the entry is objected to, and that person should ideally enter only under a court order. So we can see that neither of these statutory provisions are prescriptive in terms of how to avoid that using a court order, and therefore it's seen as best practice really that a court order would be applied for to avoid any of these situations where you're falling foul of criminal law trespass or violent entry. So how then does the borrower react? How then can a borrower postpone this if they object? And we have got two key ways of dealing with it. The most important one and the most procedural one really being under Section 36 of the Administration of Justice Act 1970. We've got a way there of looking at the protection available for the borrower by going to court in some way. Section 36 is reactive, so Section 36 allows postponement where they're reacting to a court order. And the second one, the court's inherent jurisdiction to postpone possession, is what Rope Gaelic was trying to do, is their approach to court to say, I don't want this to happen. So one is reactive and the other is proactive. So section 36, it would have to be a response mechanism. The borrower would have to be responding to a court order from the lender. And the second one, the court's inherent jurisdiction, is where the borrower can approach the court themselves independently to ask for some more time. So let's look at section 36 then. The preconditions for section 36 are that we're dealing with residential property, so it has to relate to someone's home. They have to be living there, and there has to be a court order. So that would be the order that the borrower then is responding to. So there's a court order for repossession of someone's home, and section 36 will kick in. Section 36 states, where the mortgagee, so the lender, under a mortgage of land which consists of or includes a dwelling house, so residential property, brings an action in which they claim possession of the mortgaged property, the court may exercise any of the powers conferred on it by subsection 2 below, if it appears to the court that in the event of its exercising the power, the mortgagor is likely to be able, within a reasonable period, to pay any sums due under the mortgage. Now, what has happened is that we have ended up with case law that picks that phrase apart, that final sentence, the mortgagor being able to pay within a reasonable period of time the sums due under the mortgage. That sentence is key within that piece of statute, and there are many cases that evidence what that then means, and that's where we're heading in a moment. So basically, we're dealing with residential premises. The lender will have applied for a court order. It doesn't apply in situations where there's already been entry, like in Rope Gaelic, without a court order. And the court then has the ability to look at the application of the lender and decide whether it's appropriate to repossess in each instance. The borrower has to meet the criteria listed. They have to be able or likely to within a reasonable period, pay any sums due. That gives the court then the power to adjourn the possession proceedings. They can hold the bank back, they can delay it, and give a time limit as to when the repossession might occur in the future if their conditions aren't met. Or they can completely stay it altogether. They can completely say no, there's not going to be a repossession, or postpone the date of delivery of possession. The property will move over to the lender at a certain date. So all of these powers of the court will depend on their determination as to whether the borrower can repay within a reasonable period of time the outstanding balance or the sums that they feel are due, and that's where we're headed next in looking at how they calculate and decide those sums. So that phrase, that sentence that I said to you previously, that sentence that becomes key to all of this in section 36(1), that phrase of the mortgagor is likely to be able within a reasonable period to pay any sums due under the mortgage. How the court determine whether to adjourn or allow or postpone or completely hold off the bank will depend upon what it is that the borrower wants to do in asking for a postponement. So how the court consider the mortgagor's response depends on what it is that they want to do. Do they want to pay the arrears off or do they want to sell the property themselves? So thinking about why they might want to pay the arrears off would be a situation where they want to get themselves straight. They were in a pickle, they had issues, they lost their job but have gained a job and they'll be okay. They just want to get straight and stay in the house. They're going to remain there. They don't want to give it up. It's their home. So that will dictate some interpretation then to those words. The alternative would be that the borrower wants to be able to have the power to sell it themselves. They don't want the bank repossessing it. A bank would repossess a property, the property would be empty, it won't have any family in it, there won't be anybody making bread in the kitchen or the smell of coffee, kids playing out on a trampoline. It will look like what it is, a repossessed, sad tale and an empty property that will go to auction, rather than a homeowner putting a for sale board outside and selling a dream with flowers in a vase and bread in the oven and kids on a trampoline. What's happening is we have a property going to auction that is stripped bare and has a sad tale attached to it. Very different marketability there, very different way of perceiving your new home if you're a purchaser. So the borrower might know that they can't get themselves straight, but might want to have a bit of a stay of execution so that the property achieves its true value and there might be something in it for them. They might see something back from it rather than it going to auction and not achieving a satisfactory price. So the borrower basically goes to approaches the court where there's been a repossession order sought and their opinion will be consulted. They will have to explain to the court what it is that they want to do. Do they want to stay there and get themselves straight, or do they want to sell it in order to maximize the value of it and pass it on to a new purchaser themselves? So, if they want to stay and pay off the arrears, what do those words mean? What does that phrase, the mortgagor is likely to be able within a reasonable period to pay any sums due under the mortgage, what does that mean? To pay any sums due, so how much would that be? Previously, under old law in Halifax and Clark, that would have meant the whole sum, the entire sum due under the mortgage. So whatever you still owed the bank, you would have to repay them. So if you had £120,000 left of a £180,000 mortgage, you wouldn't just pay them the amount you were in arrears for. You would have to find all of the remaining money. So it's seen as quite harsh. And we see actually as a response to Halifax come in under Section 8 of a new Administration of Justice Act 1973. We can see that this response is swift of the legislature to say no, that's not okay, Clark's not correct, that's not what was intended by statute. It doesn't mean the outstanding sums of anything. It means whatever they are in arrears for. So if they have fallen behind by £3,000, they have to pay the £3,000, not the full 180 or whatever was left. So any sums due used to mean the entire sum, now just means whatever they are outstanding for, whatever they're in arrears for, the last few months basically of missing payments. Okay, what does a reasonable period of time mean? So how can they repay that? They've already been struggling to keep up their mortgage payments. how long do they have to get themselves straight again? It used to be under Norgan we had, after Norgan we have it being able to be stretched across the whole term of the mortgage. Before that, reasonable period of time used to mean a few years, where they would be allowed to chip away at the arrears that they had over the next few years of mortgage payments. Whereas now, since Norgan, we have that reinterpreted, that if, say for example, they were in £3,000 worth of arrears, that would be stretched over the remaining term of their mortgage. So they have 16 years left on their mortgage, for example. It will be calculated into their monthly payments over those 16 years. So it will make their monthly payment to the bank a little bit more each month, but they'll have 16 years to get themselves straight. And is it likely? Okay, so bearing in mind these people have been struggling, they haven't been keeping up with their payments. So how now are we going to ask them to pay a little bit more each month in order to get themselves straight? How are we going to calculate it that they were previously paying £600 a month and they couldn't keep up with that? Now we're asking them to pay £625 a month and we're letting them stay in the house. So what there has to be is there has to be some sort of realistic prospect that their fortunes have changed in some way, that something has happened to turn their fortunes around, with some evidence of that. We see two key cases here, Syed and Julian, both in the early 90s recession, where we have business people that have been made redundant or who've lost jobs, lost businesses. And we have a situation where in those cases people hadn't been able to find new employment, they hadn't been able to secure a new job or a new prospect or new employment. And it's fine to say that you want to stay somewhere and you can pay a bit more each month, but unless you have evidence of a new job that will support that, then that's not going to happen. And in Syed and Julian, we can see that the courts won't take a gamble in that way. They will want to know that there is some realistic prospect that a new job is happening, or that something has improved your circumstances so that you can pay back those sums due, the £3,000 that you're in debt for, over the next 16 years, because you've got a job that will help support you do that. So that's what the purpose would be in interpreting the words of section 36.2 in relation to a borrower who wants to stay in the property. If the borrower wants to sell it themselves because they feel that it would be a more attractive option for them to sell rather than the bank selling an empty shell of a property in auction, then any sums due means the entire sum. What that means is obviously that won't work if the property's what's known as in negative equity. So if the property is now only worth £130,000 and you owe the bank £150,000, then the court aren't going to allow you any voice. The court aren't going to allow you to take control of that sale because you're not actually able to satisfy the bank's debt. So you're not going to be repaying them in full. So the court won't allow you the ability to sell it yourself. The bank will have control in that situation. Within a reasonable period of time is literally just the amount of time it would take to sell a property. Again, knowing that that sale has to be realistic, and we'll look at that in a minute when we think about how likely it is a thing to happen. So in NatWest and Provincial Building Society and Lloyd, we could see that if there was evidence that the sale could be completed within a period such as 6 to 12 months, then that is evidence enough that the borrower can pay the bank back within a timely period, and that's enough. So 6 to 12 months was the time period considered in Lloyd, and then in Ellis we have slightly longer than a year, but didn't have to be that long. So we have 6 to 12 months in Lloyd, and we have just over a year in Ellis as being allowed for by the court to allow this sale to go through. Now, a year is a very long time to allow a conveyance, because a normal conveyance should take a couple of months. We have some real generosity there in those situations. So we usually have a maximum of 6 to 12 months, but clearly there's no fixed rule because Ellis was allowed to happen over a longer time period. And then how likely is it? It has to be more than just a for sale board outside. There has to be, again, some real prospect and evidence of a sale happening. So it can't just be that the borrower wants to take control because they'd like to be able to sell it in a more attractive way. They ideally now have to, or actually have to, have started that process and have some evidence to satisfy the court that there's a real buyer in mind and a sale on the table starting to happen. So in Target Clothiers we have a borrower who showed evidence of an interested purchaser who had made an offer. So they were given 3 months in Target Clothiers because that was only an offer. So we had 6 to 12 months in Lloyd where there was a sale happening and it was further down the process than that. But in Target Homes and Clothier we see it was just given 3 months to Farrell because of the offer state of this sale rather than being any further down the road. It hadn't exchanged or anything like that. So this is the movable feast really for the court to determine. A bank has gone to them to seek a repossession of a domestic dwelling. The court will allow, under Section 36 of the Administration of Justice Act 1970, will allow the borrower to request a postponement of that. If the purpose of the postponement is to sell it themselves, we can see here that they'll have to be able to satisfy all the bank's debt. They'll have to show that a sale is likely and there's evidence of that, and it will happen within a reasonable time period. If the borrower wants to stay, as previously evidenced, they will have to be able to pay the debt that they're in so far, so the arrears that they've amassed. They can stretch that, however, over the remainder of their mortgage term, as long as they can show that there's some real prospect and evidence of an upturn in their situation. Other than that then, so other than the courts getting a repossession order from the bank and responding to that by telling the borrower and giving the borrower the opportunity to postpone, the borrower can approach the court themselves. It's fairly limited, however, because it really is just a moment for the courts to allow the borrower to take stock and deal with what's happening. So we get in Kant this phrase, it's a short time to afford the mortgagor or the borrower a chance of paying the mortgage in full. That's like all of the outstanding debt, or otherwise satisfying the bank, but this should not be done if there's no reasonable prospect of this occurring. So in Birmingham they were only given 28 days, and it's usually used in situations where there's a commercial property being dealt with, because if it was residential it would be dealt with under Section 36, or like Cropi Gaelic where there has already been a repossession without a court order. So the the person who has the home has heard about it or found out about it but hasn't had a court order, the property is empty and they can apply to the court if they get there before the property is repossessed. But that's not what happened in Rugby Gaelic, because the repossession had already happened. So it's a fairly limited authority of the court to listen to a borrower who, either in a commercial case or a residential case where they're not there, has found out that this stuff is happening. And it will basically give them a very brief moment to pause and see if they can please the bank in some way. But it's, again, fairly last ditch, because if it's gotten to that stage, they've not been able to keep the bank happy thus far, so it's very unlikely they will be able to. So yeah, as I said, it's limited. It's only used where Section 36 would be unavailable. So let's say commercial properties, or dealing with where somebody has already peacefully re-entered, or you know that they're about to and they haven't given you a court order. So what I wanted to do was, and please don't switch off now because I'm going to talk about what's coming next, is look at how the bank can repossess property. So looking at that situation where the bank are wanting to take the property back, usually in order to free it to sell it, which is where we're headed next week. Best practice always to achieve a court order in that scenario. Come to things with clean hands, but not a legal requirement. The court order, where given, would allow a moment for a mortgagor to be prompted to postpone or to request a postponement. We've looked at that postponement under Section 36 of the Administration of Justice Act 1970. The court's interpretation of that varying depending on whether the borrower wants to stay in the property and get themselves straight, or whether they want an opportunity to push through a more satisfactory sale themselves and achieve a better value for the property. Failing that, they could have applied themselves to court to postpone the action. And where we're headed next really is to then think about how the bank would sell a property, how they behave in a sale, who they can sell to, and how the mortgagor can respond to a sale situation. So that's where we're headed next. And then after that, thinking about the borrower's ability to be free of the bank and or to use the defence of undue influence. Thank you.